Welcome to Civil Justice for SA Survivors.
Welcome back to Civil Justice for SA Survivors with attorney Marc Pearlman and Melissa Anderson. Marc and Melissa represent survivors of SA or sexual assault and exploitation across Illinois, guiding them through the civil justice process with compassion and clarity. I'm your host, Lisa Mosby, and today we're talking about who can be held civilly responsible beyond the abuser. Welcome, Marc. Welcome, Melissa. Glad to have you back.
Good to see
Good
you,
afternoon, Lisa.
Yeah, in civil SA cases, why does responsibility often extend beyond the individual who caused the harm?
That's a great question. And, cause the harm is the key point there, because the perpetrator of the SA isn't necessarily the only person that caused the harm, or not necessarily the primary person who caused the harm. And, I often use a really crude analogy that Melissa's heard like 1,000 times now, but it really makes the point. So I apologize to anybody if the crude analogy seems like it's disrespectful in any way. It's not intended to be at all. But if I have a dog and my dog bites people, I really have three choices with respect to what to do with my dog. I could, one, put my dog to sleep, which might seem harsh, especially if my dog doesn't bite me and I love my dog, then that's not necessarily the option I would want to choose. Secondly, I could put a sign on my dog's cage, keep my dog locked up, and the sign would say, "My dog bites people, please don't go near the cage or put your hand in the cage." Lastly, I could open the front door, let my dog run around the neighborhood, bite as many people as possible, and then when they come to my house and say, "Hey, your dog bit me," I could act surprised and say, "Oh my gosh, he's never done that before." And if I pick option number 3, who's worse, me or the dog? So again, crude, but that pretty much explains how we typically view those that enable the abuse and actually cause the abuse. Because if responsible people and entities if they responded correctly to the information they had initially, then every perpetrator would have one victim.
And especially with children, any parent assumes that when your children have been entrusted to an institution, school, a church, Boy Scouts, things like that, there's an expectation when children are involved that the institution is doing everything possible to make it as safe as they can for your children. And when an institution chooses not to do anything or to put safeguards in place and not enforce them, it's really the institution that didn't directly cause the harm by the SA, but could have prevented it. And it's important, because if you're not holding those institutions accountable, their children just aren't going to be safe regardless of the environment.
And I genuinely believe that these institutions are asking themselves the wrong question. I think the question they ask themselves is, how do we protect ourselves? And the question they should be asking is, how do we protect the children?
With your years of experience, what kinds of institutions or organizations do you see most commonly involved in civil responsibility claims in Illinois?
Yeah, it varies a great deal, but primarily, obviously, institutions that deal with children a lot, because children are so vulnerable. So from schools to religious institutions to sports, youth sports, but it really could be anywhere. There are vulnerable adults at, for example, nursing homes, or people that are in institutions like rehabilitation centers and things of that nature. So it's fairly widespread. But I would say any institution where their business is primarily dealing with children and or vulnerable adults.
And to a certain extent, we see a lot of employers out there too, where there's the power dynamic is such that somebody who would not be, you would immediately look at them and think they might be susceptible to, sexual assault. But when there's a power dynamic where one person has most of the power, it's important that employers too pay attention to that and have safeguards in place and structurally are set up in a way where people know what the rules are and know where to go if something's happened.
It really can happen anywhere. And if we are not exposed to it or have not had this experience in the past, we don't realize all of the opportunities for this to happen exist.
And oftentimes, it's interesting because we'll find whether it's an employer or some other kind of institution, and we ask them about their policies with respect to prevention of SA, and they say, "Oh, well, we have a handbook, and it says that SA won't be tolerated." And then, our next question is, okay, what else other than it being mentioned in your handbook? And they say, "What do you mean, what else?" Then, well, if that's the extent of what you've done, then you really are not doing enough to protect the victims of these crimes.
And and as you said, it can happen anywhere. Obviously, bigger institutions you hear hear about it a lot, but it's happening everywhere, and you just don't necessarily hear about it as much. You hear the same institutions, but a lot of times that's because they are bigger and global and more widespread. So that's why we hear about the same. But we do know that this is happening everywhere, particularly anywhere where children are left in the care of other people.
And as much as SA is being talked about today, and it seems like it's in the news a lot, it remains one of the most underreported crimes there is.
Wow.
I think the statistics are something like 80% to 90% never tell a soul.
And you mentioned like responsibility on behalf of the employer or the organization. Having it in the handbook isn't enough. How does the law evaluate whether an institution had a legal duty to protect someone from harm?
Well, there's particular relationships that establish that legal duty often. It's an easy one is when children are not with their parents and are entrusted into the care of someone else. So that is, that does create a legal duty. A lot of different particular relationships like that will create a different legal duty in terms of what's required. But there's also then just a general negligence standard that can apply as well. In terms of acting reasonably under the circumstances.
So often it comes down to foreseeability. Is it foreseeable that if you allow an adult to be alone with a child behind closed doors, is it foreseeable that the child could be sexually a victim of SA? If the answer is yes, then the entity you can establish liability against the entity.
So if it's foreseeable and there is a failure to act, what does that look like in civil cases? How does that factor into responsibility for that organization?
The way you stated the question, then there would be legal responsibility because there's an obligation to act, and it was foreseeable what could happen. So there would be responsibility of the entity, and then once you establish responsibility, then the second part of the analysis is damages. How has this impacted the particular victim survivor's life, and what does that look like?
And what is rather than failure to act, what is the action that needs to happen at that point? I know it depends is the typical answer, but can you give us some ideas on what is expected of these companies, organizations, to move forward, to act responsibly? What do they need to do?
If there's put safeguards in place to protect, but I think more importantly, follow their own rules and regulations about what is and isn't allowed. That's oftentimes pretty clear when you have a laundry list of things that are supposed to be put in place that are their internal rules about something. And it's just so obvious, sadly, a lot of times the people who are within the institution who have access to children or vulnerable adults don't even know that those rules exist. I mean, it's shocking sometimes when you ask the people who are in charge at some of these places and say, can you tell us about what sort of safeguards there are and what rules are with respect to a particular thing? And they don't know. And that's terrifying, considering they're the ones responsible for making sure that everyone else there is not only aware of the rules, but following them as well.
And also, I think what's in 2026, what's really lacking is education about what is appropriate, what is inappropriate, things of that nature. And when I say education, I don't mean providing someone a 5-page paper about it. I mean having professionals come in and discuss it with the entity, the employees of the entity, so that people know what to be looking for. And generationally, my children are a lot better equipped than I was in understanding that SA might be going on, number one, and number two, what things are appropriate or inappropriate in terms of your own conduct. So I believe, and fortunately or unfortunately, depending on your age, a lot of the individuals that are in charge of large entities, that they were raised in a generation where this just was not discussed. And so education is critical in that regard.
Does the analysis change when the abuse occurred in a setting involving minors versus adults?
To a certain extent, yeah, it's a lot. Sometimes it's a lot more obvious and easy to establish that there was a duty to protect a child rather than an adult. So in that regard, it's the analysis is more straightforward because again, you children entrusted to your care, there's a duty created. It's not as clear with adults, but it just really depends on the circumstances and the nature of the relationship there, and sometimes whether a duty has been assumed because of that relationship that's established.
And likewise, the foreseeability issue is more obvious with a child than it might be with an adult. That said, in most relations that we have with employers, or perhaps it could be a different relationship, there is a power dynamic that creates one, a duty, and two, foreseeability. If your boss is engaging in inappropriate SA with you, that there's liability there by virtue of the fact that he or she is your boss, and it's foreseeable that a boss might do that to somebody because of the power dynamic.
And a lot of times people, when this happens to them, they think they are alone, and that this has never happened, particularly with respect to their perpetrator, never happened before, because there's the assumption, sadly, that it was somehow their fault or that they invited it, and that's why this happened to them. It's really very sad once they come forward and we discover that this is not the first time somebody has done this. And sadly, we see that in our cases that we handle dealing with employers. There's not sometimes the same reporting obligations when an adult does this to another adult. So this is often swept under the rug with an employer. Because sadly, oftentimes the person doing this is the person in charge, ultimately. So, when people do come forward, there's a lot of times they think I must be the only person that this has ever happened to, because we would know if this was happening, if this had happened before. We see, and it's in the news all the time, you see sometimes it's the principal of a school who's responsible for doing this, or the CEO of a company or somebody in charge of thousands of people that are, and there's the misconception that there's no way that this is the person that could be doing this, and certainly no way that it's known to at least some people at the institution that this has been going on.
And another really important issue is that the perpetrators themselves, they manipulate the situation to make the victim survivor feel special. This isn't a crime. This is, oh my gosh, you're special. I love you. I'm attracted to you. So they put it in the context of a relationship. So then survivors then go, once the SA occurs, they go, oh my gosh, what did I do to make this person attracted to me? Why me and not somebody else? So they're constantly questioning themselves about what they did to bring this on, when in fact, in the vast majority of the time, this perpetrator has done the same exact thing with other individuals, not only at different times, but often at the same exact time. Person A walks in and they make person A feel really special, and like what they have is love and attraction and things of that nature. And when person A leaves, in 2 hours later, person B could walk in and they're treated exactly the same way.
Yes. Sadly, with groups of children, sports teams, we see it, classmates, they think that and sometimes we see this where sometimes Marc and I are the only ones that know that we've heard from people that have connections, that are in school together at the same time 20, 30 years ago. And we know that this was happening to more than one child at a time by the same perpetrator at the same institution. You've got a sports team. Chances are it's not happening to one kid on the team, because usually access is why this happens to children more than anything specific with regard to that particular child. There's a misconception. Part of the reason sometimes people don't come forward is they think it was something specific to them. I was weak, or it was obvious that I needed that attention, things like that. And oftentimes, I would say for the most part, it doesn't have anything to do with the person that this has happened to, and really comes down to the fact that this perpetrator had access to the child or the adult that this happens to.
And the other thing also with the power dynamic is the victim often feels like they can't do anything because the perpetrator has so much power over them for their future. So if you're an Olympic gymnast and you're going to Nassar at Michigan State, and the Olympic coaching team knows about some of the things that are going on, if you speak up, your career might be over. Likewise, if you're in a job and you speak up, your career might be over. For young athletes in sports, oftentimes the person that's responsible for determining whether you get to the next level, whether you get to a college scholarship, is the perpetrator. Therefore, what are you going to do? Are you going to speak up and jeopardize your scholarship, or are you going to remain quiet so that you can fulfill your dreams? And that is not something any child or vulnerable person should be exposed to.
Marc, Melissa, I really want to thank you for creating a lot of clarity around misunderstandings that happen when we don't know. And thank you for inviting people to reach out to you and connect with you. And I think we'll leave it there for today. That's it for today's episode of Civil Justice for SA Survivors. If you'd like to learn more about civil accountability options for survivors in Illinois, you can reach out to pearlmananderson.com for additional resources. Thank you for listening, and we will see you next time If you know of somebody that could benefit from this conversation and from getting some understanding or clarity around misunderstandings, please share this episode with them and do encourage them to reach out. And we will see you at the next episode.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.